Hello. We now turn to London, the other big city involved in the psychedelic era of the late 60s. It focuses around beat poets like Allen Ginsberg and bookstore owner Barry Miles, and a large philosophical poetry event that was held at Albert Hall in 1965. Kind of like this was the English equivalent of the Human Being that happened over in San Francisco in 67. But both of these events, the Human Being in San Francisco and the the London Albert Hall Beat Poet Gathering in 65, were a major gathering for hippie culture in both London and San Francisco. In London, sometimes known as swinging London, where we have the mod culture, the urban new, the hip things of the time, very colorful after the Beatles have kind of broken things wide open. But we're going to see a lot more what we would say are avant-garde changes and ambitious ideas. When we use the phrase avant-garde in art, we're talking about things that are exotic and different and strange, very similar to the way we've been describing psychedelic music in the United States. But where things have been exotic and strange in the United States, it has been based out of jazz or out of folk rock or out of rock and roll, and then it explodes from those areas. Avant-garde here in London is going to be rising out of the British blues revival, as well as just a very mod culture, which is exploring strange, new, weird things. Among the prominent bands of the 60s psychedelic culture in London are going to be Pink Floyd, Soft Machine, and Tomorrow. And most notably, Pink Floyd is going to begin in a very, kind of similar to the Grateful Dead, very exploring a lot of improvised soundscapes, again, but not in a jazz or folk way, in more of an art music avant-garde improvised way that has rock and blues elements moving throughout. We can also hear these elements in more of a pop style with bands like Soft Machine and Tomorrow. The Rolling Stones, again, is coming strongly out of that British blues revival. By the end of 66, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, they are going to be the songwriting duo that's leading many of the hits coming out of the Rolling Stones, and their album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request, is going to depart away from what the Beatles have been up to, and it's really going to get back to rhythm and blues. So bringing some of those psychedelic elements, not quite as much as what's going on with Pink Floyd, for example, but the Rolling Stones are going to kind of more focus on their bad boy outlaw image and their blues roots. Cream is an example of a British blues psychedelic band, featuring the lead guitarist Eric Clapton. Remember, formerly of the Yardbirds, but when he left the Yardbirds, that's when Jimmy Page stepped into the Yardbirds, but Eric Clapton then went to Cream. And Cream is going to be doing much more, compared to the Yardbirds anyway, Cream is going to be doing much more serious or long play virtuosic versions of blues music. Rather than pop tunes that are just a few minutes long, Cream is going to be exploring long play improvised British blues hits. Their song Sunshine of Your Love from 1968 is going to be really based around a consistent 12-bar blues format with a riff that just keeps coming back again and again and again, which is a really distinctive trait of this song. So when you're listening to Sunshine of Your Love, listen for the lick blues tradition, where there's a certain pattern that is always going to be heard again and again and again throughout each of Clapton's guitar performances in all of the strings of this song. The standard instrumentation, standard meter, 12-bar blues format. But compare this psychedelic late 60s British blues to some of the earlier blues that we heard from like early Rolling Stones or even from the late 50s. Jimi Hendrix is technically from Seattle, but he is going to live for quite a time in England and in the London area. So he is going to be at this time associated with the London British Blues Revival. And many of his approaches, much like Eric Clapton, he would be called a virtuoso of blues guitar. And he had a very distinctive style, not just in the way he played, but in the way he even strung his instrument. He played left-handed, whereas most other people would have held it like this. He was holding it like this. He also kind of facilitates the growth into glam rock that's going to become a much more popular thing in the 70s. You'll see on this slide one of Jimi Hendrix's stagecraft devices was to light his guitar on fire. You'd pour some like lighter fluid or something on it and then light that and then have a little dance seance over it. But that kind of showmanship, that kind of it's not just the way I play, it's the performance and the visual spectacle that I'm bringing to the entire performance that makes Jimi Hendrix kind of stand apart from a lot of other musicians of the time. I don't think Eric Clapton ever lit his guitar on fire though, but both Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton, genius musicians, very, very talented at how they could solo on their guitar and just pull up all of these amazing licks from song to song. So when you're listening for these types of blues virtuosic performances in the Jimi Hendrix Experience, the name of his band, in 1967, their hit Purple Haze from the album Are You Experienced is going to, similar to Clapton and Cream, is going to feature 4/4 meter standard blues instrumentation, but we're going to hear a long extended introduction. And this is one of the things Hendrix is famous for, is the way he uses dissonance. And dissonance isn't just in when you play two notes that are close together so they sound harsh, but also dissonance in the way he could evoke feedback from the amps sometimes. And keep in mind, Kovacs has described the way Hendrix plays his guitar here in kind of a sitar-like way. Again, getting into some of these Indian music elements that Ravi Shankar was introducing, that the Beatles were exploring, and that even Hendrix, while playing electric guitar, was now emulating in the way he performed. Also over in Great Britain, we have some other important bands and artists like Steve Winwood with the band Traffic, the singer-songwriter Van Morrison, who is going to write a lot of folk rock pop tunes in a more of an English experimental style. Psychedelic folk is a fun thing. If you haven't heard of Donovan or heard any of his music, he is very much like a trippy Woody Guthrie, or kind of basically a psychedelic folky guy. When you listen to his when you listen to some of Donovan's folk songs, they have kind of Tomorrow Never Knows type lyrics, but sung by a guy with an acoustic guitar. It's a soothing yet strange kind of folk psychedelic sound. So we've kind of covered both San Francisco and London, the two prime areas, the two main areas for psychedelic music activity in the 60s. But there were other things going on too, such as in Los Angeles and New York, bands like the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield were two bands coming out of Los Angeles. They were having hits in the late 60s. The Doors were also coming out of Los Angeles in the mid to late 60s. The Doors, an interesting type of blues psychedelic band in that they do not have a lead guitar. They do not have a bass player. They're going to have an organ player, and then they're also obviously going to have Jim Morrison leading their lyrics and doing their stagecraft antics. But a lot of the Doors lyrics are going to explore some of the eclectic beat poet writings of from this era, and definitely exploring darker sides of life and the darker side of taking a trip to a higher consciousness place. Iron Butterfly is probably one of the heaviest bands coming out of this era. Their hit In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida from 1968 is going to start to introduce things that are going to grow into things that are eventually going to be called heavy metal, but we're not there yet. But if you're looking for the early signs of heavy metal, start looking at the way Iron Butterfly is using power chords and over-amplified bass and drums to really kind of big out a booming, darker sound. Over in New York, bands like Vanilla Fudge have pretty long cover versions of other people's songs, but the length is what kind of makes them abstract and psychedelic. And then we still have Bob Dylan cooking along, and he's going to record with a famous group called The Band. A lot of their music is going to be featured at big festivals like Woodstock. Which brings me to another big feature of this era, and that is festivals. Woodstock is, by all means, kind of the high point of the music festival life of the psychedelic era. But on comparison, at the other end of the spectrum, if Woodstock was a place that was the high point of the psychedelic era, the pinnacle of hippie culture, where hundreds of thousands of people claim to gather together in peace and love and drugs and sex and rock and just have an amazing experience out on the farm in upstate New York. On the other hand, Altamont in California is considered by many to kind of be the symbolic end of the hippie era, or the positive vibe associated with the hippie era. At Altamont, the Rolling Stones, among many other bands, were featured, but it was a free festival, and it did not have, shall we say, professional security to handle all the crowds of people who were coming here to this festival. Specifically, the Stones hired the motorcycle gang Hells Angels to provide security, and the Hells Angels were notorious for their techniques, literally clubs and sawed-off pool sticks and chains to beat back the fans that were getting too close to the band or doing things that were threatening to the band. Literally at one point during the concert, when the Stones were performing, there was an altercation right down front, close to the stage, and one of the fans in the audience was killed. And it's a really tragic end to the festival culture. And out of that, we're gonna see a lot of things get more organized, and the open-ended ways of just peace, love, and hippie culture are going to not going to be allowed to kind of run amok as much as they did for that one bright moment, say at Woodstock, but then that dark moment at Altamont really closed things down and put us on a different path that we're going to explore more specifically in the 70s. I do want to close, though, with one more point, and that is just about the way AM is going to evolve, or really AM is going to stay rock steady on pop singles, and FM is going to evolve. Remember, FM, I said earlier, is starting to feature in the San Francisco area psychedelic music for people who want to tune in to that Berkeley area, and they're looking for this new radio means. Radio is still the dominant media to collect new music that you can just access at home or in your car. Radio is the main way people consumed music if they couldn't afford to buy a record or go to a concert. FM radio is going to evolve, though, from an eclectic thing that was just for psychedelic college music to now here's where all of the hits are going to be heard when you want to hear long play songs. And when we get to FM radio in the 70s, it's going to be very different than AM radio in the 70s. And that's just going to kind of set the stage for kind of a more fracturing in the American audience, as we have black pop that's moving along, funk that's growing up, psychedelia that's in building and then relaxing, and prog rock and glam rock that are coming soon. So we've really kind of set the stage for several different things to evolve and eventually come to tension. But we're leading up to one big question in a chapter or two, and that is, what is classic rock? What makes the things we call classic rock, and is it at what cost is classic rock happening? Is it happening for creative, artistic reasons, or is it happening because, hey, we have found a formula that sells a lot of money, let's do that? That's going to be a big debate that a lot of people are going to argue about in the 70s, primarily when they start looking at the differences between punk and disco. And then, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is going to kind of wrap it up for the Psychedelia chapter. Please check out the online exit slip question waiting for you in Blackboard. Thank you.